Good afternoon, and welcome to the college's presentation on the standard for maintaining professional boundaries and what TCM practitioners need to know. My name is Claudia Fish, Manager, Quality Practice, and we thank you so much for taking the time today to attend our presentation. Today's webinar provides an opportunity for you to better understand the standard on maintaining professional boundaries. We'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation and have enabled our Q&A feature. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the questions box, and we will do our best to answer them. You can also email your questions to the college afterwards, as a recording of this webinar will be provided at a later date on the college's website, along with frequently asked questions. Following today's webinar, a certificate will be issued to all of those joining us today. Please note that it will take approximately 1 day for you to receive the certificate, but as a reminder to all of our members, you can also record your professional development activities in the professional development log, which can be found on our college's website and be downloaded. I'm now happy to introduce to you our special guests, Rebecca Durkin, partner at Steineke Macura LeBlanc, and Amy Lee, professional practice advisor. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And without further ado, I would like to pass things over to Amy to introduce the topic and to start our presentation.
Thank you, Claudia. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited that everybody could make it. So today, Rebecca and I will be talking about the standard for maintaining professional boundaries. I was just going to confirm where we can find this information, Rebecca. So at a later date, if any of our members miss the opportunity, where can they find this information?
Thank you, Amy. So if we could progress to the next slide, the college has actually flagged this, that you can locate the substance of what we're going to be talking about in two main documents. The first document is the standard that the college has created on maintaining professional boundaries, and that can be located on the college website. And another great resource for members to review, just not on this topic, but other topics, is the Jurisprudence Course Handbook. And again, that is also available on the college website.
That's awesome, thank you. So let's just jump right into this. What is it meant by professional boundaries?
Sure, so if we could progress to the next slide, please. We've set out a couple bullets here as to what the college is talking about when it uses the term professional boundaries. And at its core, it really is an expectation that regulated health professionals will always maintain a professional and respectful relationship between themselves and their patients. The core, the rationale for this expectations is that at all times, there has to be a recognition that the patient is in a vulnerable position. And this is not meant to be paternalistic. This is just recognizing that patients come to regulated health professionals when they are seeking treatment, when they are in pain, when they are seeking assistance, when they are coming to you because you have more knowledge on this issue than they would. So that always needs to be respected and kept in mind. It also is important to keep in mind that this is always at its core in the patient's interest. It is in the patient's interest that a member always maintain professional boundaries. This is not an expectation that is imposed just upon this college or its members. This is an expectation amongst all regulated health professionals, and it is expected to be discharged at all times. The members need to demonstrate not just to their patients, but to their colleagues, to the college, and to the government and public that they are worthy of this trust. They are worthy of the power that has been granted to them as regulated health professionals.
That's awesome, thanks. So can we move on to what the key principles are?
Of course. So what we're going to talk about here, Amy, is we're going to take out some of the principles that the college has set out in its standard that we referred to earlier. And you will see here on this slide the 4 principles that the college has articulated in its standard. 1, members should refrain from treating people with whom they have a close personal relationship. 2, members must set professional boundaries with each patient. 3, members must maintain those professional boundaries with each patient. And 4, members must safeguard the privacy and dignity of their patients.
Okay, so can we narrow in on number 1? Members should refrain from cheating people with whom they have a close personal relationship with. Who does this apply to? And why is this important?
Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So as to who this, there we are. As to who this should apply to, who does this apply to? So members need to be mindful that obviously as members of the college, the expectation applies on them. But when we talk about close personal relationships, that can depend on the facts. So it may be a friend, it may be a relative, it may be even sometimes an acquaintance or a business partner. It's going to depend on the facts. The college trusts the member to discharge knowledge, skill, and judgment. If there is a concern that the person is perhaps close enough where their judgment could be impacted, the member needs to be able to tell that person, I'm sorry, I can't treat you because of our close personal relationship. And the rationale for this principle is that it's understood that when you, as a member, are close to someone, when you care about someone, if you have other interests in that person, your professional judgment can be impacted. Your professional judgment will not be the same as if it was a person that you are at an arm's length. So that is why the principle, that is why the expectation occurs. And why, you ask, why is this important? Because it really ensures and communicates to those patients that you do treat that you're going to put their interests at heart and that you yourself have no conflicting interests when you provide treatment to them. The one little caveat I wanted to provide a flag for you, Amy, is that when we talk about close personal relationships, and we're going to talk about a couple of exceptions that may apply, when we're talking about your spouse, members are not permitted to treat their spouse or with someone they have a sexual relationship, okay? A spouse with whom they have a sexual relationship, except in an emergency. So my advice to members would be, you need to ensure that you are never treating your spouse, because that will ensure that you are not breaching this standard and other standards.
So you mentioned about an emergency, an exception with an emergency. What would be an example of an emergency?
So again, it's sometimes going to depend on the facts. What the courts have said usually is an emergency is just that, is that something that has been sudden, unexpected. We've seen situations of when a woman goes into labor unexpectedly, very early, and her husband, who is a doctor, delivers the baby. That was not considered to be offside because of the emergent situation to it. So in this profession, there will need to be a consideration by members as to what would be considered an emergency in order to treat your spouse or to treat anyone that you're in a close personal relationship. That theoretically, any TCM emergency should ideally be able to be handled by another professional. But if it is sudden, if it is emergent, if there are no other options, then the courts and the college will likely be satisfied that there was no other option because of the emergency.
Can we have the next slide, please? What if the person of a close personal relationship doesn't feel comfortable with anyone else except for you, and you don't know anybody with the same level of skill set?
So again, it's going to sometimes depend on the situation. So if you're talking about, let's say your spouse does not feel comfortable with anyone else. There have actually been some recent court cases which said that's not sufficient, that even in those sort of fact patterns, even if your spouse only trusts you, that is not enough to allow you to use that exception. Now, if there may be situations, if a friend or if a colleague says that they will not seek treatment unless it is from you, that might be possible, because in that situation, you as the member will want to ensure that there is no other option available. You're going to want to try and make efforts to refer that person out. You're going to want to try and encourage that patient that they can have confidence in other members of the profession. So you will want to make sure that there are no other options available, and you're going to want to document the steps you took to ensure that there was no other option available. If that actually exists, then the college may be satisfied that you have made best efforts to try and facilitate treatment somewhere else. But you can see it's really going to sometimes, it's going to be dependent on the facts of that case.
So in these cases, the member must inform the patient about potential boundaries and conflict of interest issues. So that's the most important thing to document inside your record keeping.
I would agree that you'd want to document all the efforts you made to make sure there is actually no other option available. And then you're going to, as you just said, you're going to want to ensure that you have a frank discussion with that person and say, this is somewhat irregular. This may put you at a bit at risk because I care about you or I know about you. There may be a boundary issue here. There may be conflict of interest issues here. Are you still okay after all that information I've provided to you? Sometimes the patient might say, actually, no, I should go somewhere else. But if the patient is fine, then you can proceed. But you need to have that dialogue with that person in advance.
Okay, great. So with the next slide, we're going to be talking about Principle 1, the emergencies. What if you live in a remote area and there's no other practitioners where you live, so you can't really refer out?
Okay.
How does that work with our college?
I would say that in those sort of situations, again, we spoke earlier about sort of for the medical profession, a baby being delivered, that would be considered an emergency. But the courts have said, if it's urgent, if it's sudden, if your care is necessary in order to ensure that the person does not suffer serious bodily harm unless they receive treatment right away, if that threshold has been met, you can provide treatment. You won't be breaching. But if there are any, if your treatment is not necessary to prevent serious or severe bodily, you need to step back. You need to refer that patient out. So the emergency exception is quite narrow. It cannot just be used. You cannot just simply say, hey, it's an emergency, I can treat you. That's not the way the courts or the college interpret that. Will be interpreted very narrowly. And you're going to want to ensure that you only provide treatment to people that you do have a close personal relationship in an emergency, if it is truly that. If you have met that threshold, if you have provided treatment in an emergency, what you will want to do and what the college expects you to do is that once that emergency is over, and it should be quite quick, you will need to immediately refer that person to another professional, because that'll ensure that yes, you treated during the emergency, but you're not going to treat after that emergency. That patient has to be referred to another member of the college.
Okay, great. With the next slide, we're going to talk about record keeping. What does the member need to record when treating a person whom they've had that close relationship with?
So we've started from the principle that you shouldn't treat anyone that you have a close personal relationship with. Okay, that's the expectation. You shouldn't. We know, and we know why. However, we've also described that there will be certain exceptions, there will be certain situations where you will. And as we've said, what you're going to want to do is, knowing that there's an expectation that you're not going to treat that person. If you do in fact treat that person, you're going to want to describe the efforts that were made to seek alternative treatment. You're going to want to make a notation that I treated this person because it was an emergency. So you want to provide some justification at the outset as to why treatment was provided. You're also going to want to ensure that you document the discussion you had with that patient. So emergencies will be a bit different because you're probably, the patient might not be able to speak during an emergency because of that high risk issue. But if the scenarios you just talked about, you know, if you're in a remote area, if it's someone that only will trust you, if there's those certain facts, you're going to want to go through that discussion, that dialogue with the person to ensure that they still want to have received treatment from you, even though there may be a conflict of interest or a professional boundary. So that should all be set out in the record because it will be evidence that you have met the standards. It'll be evidence that you have informed the patient. And as we know, the record really should capture all relevant information, all relevant treatment, all informed consents that have been obtained from the patient. The patient record is owned by the member, but the information in that record really needs to ensure that the member is meeting the standards of the college, that the member is meeting the laws of Ontario. And that is essentially an evidentiary record that you are doing so. So it's very important that these steps, that these compliance efforts are recorded by the member in the chart.
Okay, thank you. Can you give me an example of a potential boundary and conflict of interest issue besides treating a close family member?
So we talked about close family members. We've spoken also about colleagues, business colleagues. And are we on to the next slide? There we are there. So are you looking about, you know, a possible different examples of boundary violations or different examples of people who could be treated?
Well, I'm just trying to alliterate that, you know, even if the person is in a close relationship, any type of situation that will allow you to sort of be emotionally involved or that will emotionally dictate the outcome of the treatment. So I just was looking sort of for an example of that.
So there have been a lot of cases about where treating your child, treating family members. That's usually the big example that the courts really have zeroed in on. Because as I said earlier, whether it's a friend, even if the friend, you can develop that concern. But when you're treating your children, when you're treating your siblings, when you're treating your parents, very, very few of us are going to be able to remain impartial.
Right.
Very few of us are going to be able to detach ourselves. So it's really important, again, in those scenarios to recognize that this isn't in the best interest of the patient. The patient needs to ensure that they have a practitioner that is not going to have these conflicts.
Right, and putting the patient's best interest first.
Exactly.
Right.
Always, always.
How are professional boundaries established when you're treating your patients?
So I would say it's an ongoing process. When you first meet with a patient, you also obviously want to greet them in a professional manner. You want to treat them in a professional manner. And there isn't always the same definition of professional manner. Some patients will consider using their first name impolite. Some patients might consider looking you directly in the eye as impolite or as a bit of a boundary violation. So you can see it's really important for the member to come and determine what is the best way to communicate with the patient, what makes the patient feel best, okay? You want to consider culture, gender, age, religious beliefs, sexual identity, the issue of pronouns. You want to ensure that you're using correct pronouns and obtain that information from the member. That demonstrates professionalism. That demonstrates that you are treating the patient and putting the patient's interest at the forefront. The college suggests that you can still be professional, you can still be polite, you can still be friendly without being jokey, without getting too familiar, without getting too comfortable. So it's a fine line, but it's a line that must be maintained. At the end of the day, if there's ever a consideration of should I say this or not, my advice to members would be don't say it. If you're trying to be cute, if you're trying to be fun, if you're trying to be funny, my advice to you is perhaps don't say it. That means it communicates to the patient you are a professional. You are here because of your valued judgment and skills. They have friends, they have colleagues. They're not coming to you to be friends with you. They're coming to you to seek treatment. So you'll always want to keep that in mind. One thing I do want to flag, and thank you, Amy, you've included this on this slide. It's very, very important on the issue of treatment that if any touching, if any treatment on sensitive body parts occurs, that has to have a special consent, and we're going to talk about that. But at the end of the day, remember, any touching needs to, or any treatment can only occur when the patient has provided you with informed consent. So the touch, the way you talk about the body parts needs to be professional. The way you talk about the treatment needs to be professional. The actual touching needs to be professional. The issue of robing and draping needs to be professional. At every stage, whether it's when you first meet the patient or whether it's on the 70th patient appointment, you want to ensure that you're acting professionally.
And I like the idea that you mentioned about an ongoing set of professional boundaries with your patients, and you're having this discussion almost every time, because sometimes a person may feel okay with it one day, but may not be okay with it another day. So maintaining those professional boundaries and always being professional, because that is a service that you are providing, that's a really, really good way to stress it out. With the next slide, can you give me some examples of possible risks of boundary violations?
Sure. So just take a step back. Boundary violations, as we've talked about, can occur through inappropriate comments. It can occur through inappropriate touching. It's very important to keep that boundary violations can occur in a variety of manners, and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries is an expectation unto itself. We're going to quickly at one point talk about sexual abuse. So if a touch is sexual in nature, if a behavior or remark is sexual in nature, but that's a subset of professional boundaries. Professional boundaries is much wider than sexual abuse. So you can make an inappropriate comment or touch that's not sexually abusive, but it's still a breach of these boundaries. So you can see how important it is. It's not just the most egregious touch or comment that will attract a violation of this standard. It's really important to be mindful that, again, if you're always professional, it's going to hopefully reduce any risk of you being the subject of a complaint of professional boundaries. But the risks of engaging in professional boundaries are quite significant. If you do engage in professional boundaries, obviously it creates a huge risk between yourself and that patient. That patient will likely not want to return to treatment for you. That patient might never want to return to TCM treatment because of their experience with you. It could obviously, from your perspective, result in a complaint. So that, again, you need to be very mindful of that. And I would also remind members that each of them are ambassadors of the profession. And rightly or wrongly, if a patient has a bad experience with one practitioner, they may unfairly view that the whole profession is like that. So it's not just your own reputation, it's the reputation of the profession that you carry with you at all times.
Okay, so can we talk about some of the examples of the violations?
Sure.
In a broader sense?
Sure.
We have four points here.
Yep, and I'll dive in there. So the first bullet talks about when you disclose information about your own personal life to the patient. To be blunt, that should never happen. The patient is there to come to see you, to receive treatment. Your personal life, even if you're trying to create a connection, that's not appropriate. The member at all times needs to maintain professionalism, so should not be sharing details of their own personal life. Giving or receiving gifts, this can sometimes be a bit curious for people. A lot of professions, a lot of cultures, it's a tradition to give gifts either upon significant holidays or as a way of saying thank you or a sense of gratitude. And what my advice is for members, again, thinking that they are not there as a friend, they're not there as a colleague, they're there as a regulated health professional, that when gifts are received, and again, there might be some context applied here. an appropriate and professional response would be to thank the patient very much, but to explain that out of an abundance of caution, I probably shouldn't accept this because I want to ensure that I'm maintaining or I'm meeting my standard of the college. And this is not intended to be rude. This is not intended to be disrespectful at all. It's just ensuring that there is no blurring of boundaries, that the patient doesn't feel that you become friends, that the patient doesn't feel they're going to get advantageous treatment if they give you a gift. And of course, there really is no room for regulated health professionals to give gifts to their patients. That shouldn't be happening for the reasons that I've just described.
And it's sorry.
No,
Sorry
go
to
ahead.
interrupt. It's kind of tricky because a lot of the time patients want to show the gratitude, right? And it might be rude in their culture that you don't accept the gift too.
Exactly.
So like it's sort of a fine line of explaining,
Yes.
number one, and then not to be rude or offensive.
And it will be a fine line. And again, the context will be key. So in certain cultures, if it really is going to offend the patient, if you're satisfied that they're not doing this to blur boundaries, that to actually reject would cause a sense of upset in the patient, you may thank them graciously for the gift and explain that, you know, perhaps on a go-forward basis, now that this has occurred, thank you. On a go-forward basis, I can't accept. And then maybe in the note, and you would chart it. You would chart, remember back to that evidence. You would chart that, you know, patient X provided a gift. I thank them very much and explain that this was not necessary. And on a go-forward basis, they need not do so. But I did not refuse it because of their cultural expectations. So if you put that in the chart, again, you're being very factual, you're being very honest. And that'll explain to the college, if it ever arises, why you deviated from the standard.
Sure. Great. Thank you. So the next point, taking part in business or leisure activities with the patient.
Yes, and we often see this with other professions. I've seen this, that perhaps whether concurrently or maybe right after the patient relationship ends, there's a decision to go into business together, or there's a decision to open up some venture together or rent space from one another. And again, this is not appropriate. If the patient relationship has truly ended, then people might say, well, that's fine. But if not enough time has passed, then again, the patient might feel obligated. The patient might feel indebted, or you may feel indebted. You can see why blurring can occur. So definitely when there's a concurrent relationship, that should never be happening. Making comments or gestures that are not directly related to clinical care, that sort of, as we talked about earlier, if you, at the end of the day, prevent yourself from making comments that you may think it's fun, that you may think is going to raise a laugh, best not to do so, because you don't want to jeopardize that. And one thing I just want to really, well, two things I just want to touch on quickly, Amy, is one, this responsibility always rests with the member. There are court cases which has patients making efforts to go out for coffee, where the patients make efforts to engage in personal talk. And the courts have said that's going to happen, and members need to be prepared for that. But remember, the responsibility rests with the member. So when the patient is trying to initiate these personal connections, and 9 times out of 10, it's not nefarious. They just want to get to know you. That's
right.
The requirement is for the member to be prepared for that situation and very politely explain, oh, you know, it's best that we not get into that, or unfortunately, I can't meet you for coffee after because I'm here as your regulated health professional.
Good point. Is it important to ask permission to share information with family members that are in the same room as the patient if they insist on questioning the treatment?
I hate to sound like a lawyer, but sometimes it'll depend. So if the patient is a child and the parent is in the room with you, remember there's no minimum age of consent in Ontario. So if we're talking about a very, very small child, that child will likely not be able to give consent. So their parents will be providing consent. And those sort of discussions are required because, of course, you're looking to the parent for consent. It gets a bit more different though if, let's say, a person who can provide consent, so a teenage child or even a 12-year-old, mature 12-year-old child, let's say, are in the room with their parents or a family member, and the family member then starts digging in. So again, I think it'll be really important for the member to always ensure that they know who they are obtaining consent from. Is it the child or is it the parent? And if the parent or other family member starts interfering and asking questions, it would be appropriate for the member to say, oh, you know, the patient has asked for you to be present here, but the patient is who provides consent. So I respect your questions, but I'm going to have to, you know, those discussions perhaps occur with my patient, and I probably shouldn't be giving information to you in that front. So you can see it's going to be very dependent on the facts, and it's really important for members to know, who am I obtaining consent from?
So I guess this also is important to note that maintaining appropriate boundaries with the patient's family or caregiver and support persons, that blankets the member and the relationship with your patient, not with the family members.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. We're talking about sexual abuse. Can we kind of elaborate on that a
Sure.
little bit?
And the reason the college raises this is that it's really important for members to know that certain acts that fall within breaching professional boundaries can amount to sexual abuse. Members need to remember that in Ontario, the definition of sexual abuse includes touching of a sexual nature and behavior or remarks of a sexual nature. Okay, so you can see that if some comments are sexual in nature, if some touching is considered sexual of nature, it's not only a professional boundary, we've talked about boundaries, but it can also rise to the level of sexual abuse. And it's also important to remember that it's an act of professional misconduct for a member to engage in verbal, physical, psychological, or emotional abuse. So again, certain acts that contravene the boundary between a professional and a patient could also be considered abuse, being verbal, physical, psychological, or emotional. So the college really wants to remind members that making a silly comment about someone's body type or making a silly comment about a certain body part, depending on that body part, depending on the tone, depending on the content of the comment, it could actually also rise to the level of sexual abuse. So the college really wants to remind members, if you are professional at all times, then that risk really decreases. This is not to say that members cannot make clinically appropriate comments about body parts that are part of the treatment. So if acupuncture is occurring on the buttocks, if acupuncture is or some form of massage is indicated for the breasts, that you can talk about that in a clinically appropriate manner. But members can't simply talk about breasts or buttocks or other sensitive body parts because they're a health professional. There is an expectation, again, back to the patient interest, that those discussions will occur when appropriate, but only when appropriate.
And also super important to have informed consent when that conversation needs to happen.
Informed consent has to be the bedrock of any discussion, of any treatment. And it's really important. Informed consent is just that, informed. It's not simply saying, hey, can I do this? There are other webinars and other standards that break down informed consent.
Right.
But there's a process to it, and it's an extensive process, and it's a process that puts the patient's interest at the forefront. So it's really, really important. Any body part that is touched, any body part that is being treated, you have to obtain informed consent. But when it comes to sensitive body parts, certain body parts that are inherently considered sensitive and sexual, it is incredibly important, not just for the patient, but also for the member. And the next slide if we go to the next slide. There we go. We know that the record keeping, on the issue of record keeping, that there's an expectation, and because of that sexual abuse reality, that if the patient through their discussions disclose any issue of personal boundaries that they may have or any trauma that they may have, it's very important that the member take note of that, because that will affect how the treatment occurs. But the next, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of you, but I was wondering, I think the next slide, maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but I'll mention it. If we go back to principle 2, I just want to remind members that it is a standard of this college. Again, you can look at the informed consent matter, that if you are going to touch, if you are going to treat a sensitive body part, this college mandates that you have the patient sign a form after they've provided informed consent so that you can touch that body part. Again, this is evidence that the member is providing you with consent, and it's evidence for you to rely upon that you have only engaged in that treatment after consent has been provided.
So informed as well as written consent. Record.
Yes.
Kept. Right. Perfect. Can you tell me why it's important to document limits that will affect the patient's personal boundaries?
Yes. I think you're going to, I sound maybe like a bit of a broken record, but you can see every step that we're talking about is what is in the best interest of the patient. What is in the best interest for the patient? So if the patient shares information with you about a past trauma, about certain comfort levels, you're going to want to make sure that that is written down. You don't want to forget that. You don't want to make the patient feel awkward. You don't want to make the patient feel uncomfortable. That is not what you are remotely trying to do. The patient is coming to you for help. You don't want to cause further angst. So it's very important that you take careful notes and take careful review of those notes when there are any explicit limits or requests or instructions on the part of the patient to you. So writing it is very important. It demonstrates you've been made aware of this. But also if another, let's say, member of your clinic wants to treat, the record needs to be clear. The record needs to be a record of what's been provided to you. So if other practitioners come in, they're going to see those limits. They're going to ensure that the patient is treated in the way that they wish to be treated. So we really can't emphasize enough the importance of effective and accurate record keeping.
Right. So if, for an example of this would be if there was a patient's personal boundaries where there's a history of trauma, it's important to document this in your record keeping so yourself as a member, and anyone who's going to be taking care of this patient moving forward will also know that it has been documented.
Correct.
Right. So here we're at maintaining professional boundaries with their patients. What is a member required to do if a patient decides to cross the line, cross a professional boundary? What am I supposed to do?
Great question. And this happens quite a bit. In my practice, I see this happen very frequently. So my first piece of advice for members would be prepared. Be prepared when a patient, usually unintentionally, breaches that boundary that you are trying to keep. You are trying to keep a professional boundary, a bit of a space between you and the patient, not just physical space, but actual tangible space, indicating that you are on one side of the professional relationship and they are on the other. But sometimes the patient will try and get closer, will try and really like you and want to be your friend, or may ask you out on a date or ask you out for coffee. That will happen. So the member needs to be prepared. And what needs to happen consistently and every time is the member needs to, in a very professional way, explain to the patient why that can't occur. So again, there is no ambiguity here that when a patient tries to do that, it is the member's responsibility to reassert the boundary. And it will not be a defense for a member to say, the patient wanted this. The patient asked me out. The patient wanted to be my friend. There is no room for that. Remember we spoke about it earlier about that power imbalance, that vulnerability. Right. The responsibility is always with a regulated health professional.
Again, this is also why members need to monitor professional boundaries in an ongoing, they have to reevaluate on an
Exactly.
ongoing basis, because small matters can build into bigger matters. So it's very important to sort of nip that in the bud as soon as it happens, document it, and then making sure that you have that space between you and your patient.
Very good point, Amy. And usually it does start small, right? Usually it does smart little, there might be a touch on your shoulder, or there might be a touch on the arm, or there might be a text, let's go out for coffee. And the moment you kind of get that sense that the boundaries being lessened, it's the responsibilities on you to reassert the boundary. And as you've indicated, and it should go without saying, to document that the document that you had the concern and you communicated with the patient as to why it's important to maintain boundaries.
Okay. Can we have the next slide, please? What role does the college play to protect the member if something like this happens?
So I would say that the college obviously is not here to protect the member in that way. That the college is here is to legally serve and protect the public. But what the college wants to do is it wants to assist its members. It wants to assist its members in being mindful of their expectations, in being mindful of the steps that they can take to avoid these problems, to avoid these boundaries. So the college puts on webinars such as this. The Collinar puts out standards to assist members to understand their role. So I can advise that if a complaint comes forth about professional boundaries, any complaint needs to be investigated. The college is obligated to investigate every complaint, but the members can have confidence that they're always going to be treated fairly. They will always be treated fairly. But the college will take note. Did the member attend these webinars? Did the member know about the standards? Did the member document as expected? And if a member is doing that, they really can reassure themselves that even if a complaint comes forth, they're going to be able to demonstrate that they did everything correctly. So I wouldn't suggest that it's a protecting the member per se, but there's an insurance that they are given the necessary resources to maneuver through this admittedly difficult situation.
Okay. What are some of the steps a member can take if they find they can't maintain professional boundaries with their patients?
So we've discussed, ideally when it does occur, you're going to have that discussion. You're going to have that discussion and reassert the boundaries, and you're going to include that in the record. But sometimes the touch might be too egregious. I've had situations where a patient will reach up and kiss the patient, or the patient will, the member, or the patient will disclose that they're in love with the member. And those sort of situations, the relationship can no longer continue. There's a complete blurring of boundaries. It's not in the best interest for the patient. So in that situation, in those sort of situations where the professional relationship is clearly broken, what the member will do, again, always putting the patient interest at the forefront, they're going to alert the patient that they can no longer treat them. They're going to make efforts to transfer that patient or find other places that they may wish to be transferred. And they obviously be fully transparent and say if there's any fees for transferring the patient, that's going to all occur. But you can see everything that I've spoken about is very professional. There's no sort of, oh, am I going to offend my patient? Am I going to? No, because this is a professional relationship. At all points in time, you see why it's important. There's always be a professional relationship. So that discussion, that dialogue, I can imagine it won't be pleasant for the member, but it's going to be professional.
Great. With the next slide, I know we're talking a lot about record keeping and what we need to document, but can you tell me what steps members need to consider when documenting boundary crossings or violations?
So as I said earlier, the member owns the chart, but the patient has access to that chart at all points in time, right? There is no confidentiality really on the part of the the member cannot claim to the patient, you cannot look at this chart. The courts have said no, that the patient owns the data, even though the member owns the chart. So I would remind members that when they do document possible boundary breaches, that they're always making those notations in a professional manner, that they obviously, and this should go without saying, but don't make any disparaging comments about the patient or any unnecessary graphic details. It needs to be as everything that you do, it needs to be professional. So you're going to want to ensure that you do document what happened, but you're going to want to document in a professional way. You're also going to want to document it and include it in the chart as soon as possible after the boundary, after the discussion. To be frank, any record keeping should occur as soon as possible after the event. And the reason why, from a legal perspective, is that if you document as soon after as possible, it really communicates to the patient, to the college if they're involved, to the courts if they become involved, that it was still fresh in your mind. You wrote this down when this was still fresh in your mind. So the details can be relied upon. The details, you can trust those details because this happened, I wrote it down the same day it happened. You can understand if you make that charting a week or two later, you're going to forget some details. You might not remember some aspects. So the accuracy or the legitimacy of your chart entry might not be as potent. But you're going to want to be professional. You're going to want to be accurate, and you're going to want to be as contemporaneous as possible.
Perfect. So can we move on to principle 4? Rebecca, can you tell me why having a conversation about privacy and dignity is important?
So, as we spoke about at the outset, patients come to regulated health professionals seeking help. They come to people who have much more knowledge on a topic than they do. So in this case, when a patient comes to you, Amy, they're coming to you because you are a recognized practitioner. You have gone to school, you've practiced for several years. You know this area obviously far better than anyone in the general public. And that is why patients go to professionals, because they have the necessary competencies, they have the necessary skills to help them. So that's where you always need to start off from when you are a regulated health professional. And again, this is not meant to be paternalistic. This is not meant to say that patients don't have any information. Of course they have information. A lot of patients are quite knowledgeable. But you as a regulated health professional, you are entitled to do things that are not in the public domain. You're entitled to use a title that the public cannot use. You are able to have a certificate communicating that you are regulated by a health college that's recognized and has been delegated authority from the Ontario government. So you already have a lot of power when a patient walks in. Even before they've met you, you have the power. So that is why, and again, as we go on, everything that you do needs to reflect that you are recognizing of your power, that you are not going to abuse your power, that everything you do will be in the best interest of the patient. So if you come to it with that understanding, you're going to want to ensure that anything you do is with the full consent of the patient. You're going to want to ensure that you have fully explained everything. You're going to want to ensure that when you do an explanation, you ask the patient, do you have any questions? I will remind members that you speak in a code. You have knowledge. You use terms that the average layperson does not know, does not understand. So you might be very familiar with terms, with certain acupuncture points, with certain diagnoses, but your patient may not. So you're going to always want to go back, again, putting their interest at the forefront. Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you have any questions? Let's talk about that. So that really reflects the dignity. That reflects the dignity, and it communicates to the patient that professional division between the two. We flagged for you on this slide on the issue of robing. You might think robing is not part of treatment, but you can see back to that vulnerability. Again, especially within your profession, a lot of your patients are disrobed. Think how vulnerable that person is. They're receiving treatment on a body part that may be disrobed. So that's adding another level of vulnerability. So even on issues of robing, which might not be treatment legally, you want to ensure that you're going to explain in advance how the robing would work. You want to explain if you're going to move a robe, you want to give them advance notice. that communicates that you are acting in a professional manner. You are putting the interest of your patient first. It will also avoid any claims that you were not only breaching a boundary, if you take a robe off or expose a body part, it'll avoid any obviously concerns that there's a sexual in nature. So you can see how important, when we're not just talking about treatment per se, but when we're talking about every element of your profession, robing, acupuncture, herbal medicines, the way that they are treated or welcome into your clinic, the way that they are spoken to, perhaps if even there's an outstanding chart or outstanding invoice.
Right.
Obviously you deserve to be paid for your services, but if you start screaming at the person, start pay me or I'm going to call the police, that's not how a professional acts. So at every step in the professional process, you want to ensure that you are maintaining the dignity of the patient and putting their interest at the forefront.
Great. That's really, that's very, very helpful. With the next slide, continuing with Principle 4, why is it important to speak openly about assessment and treatment procedures?
So again, you are a professional. So discussions that may be uncomfortable between a parent and a child or a friends are not going to be uncomfortable for you because you are a practitioner. You are dealing with body parts, certain body parts that may elicit giggles from certain people. That's not going to occur with you. You're able to use the terms breast. You're able to use the term buttocks. You're going to be using the correct terms because that denotes your professionalism. And you have to ensure that if you are recommending, because obviously you can't treat a body part that the patient does not consent to. If you are recommending that treatment occur on a body part, whether it be a knee, a thigh, a buttock, or the breast, that you communicate that in advance, you discuss why that would be appropriate, you go through the informed consent processes, and you obtain the consent. You don't want the patient to be surprised that a certain body part has been disrobed. You don't want a patient to be surprised that suddenly you're applying, whether it's tweener massage or acupuncture to a sensitive body part. There should be no surprise on the part of the patient as to the treatment, because of course you will have explained the treatment in advance in order to obtain informed consent. So that is why it's so important that you, again, you're being professional, you're putting the interest of the patient first, but it's also a legal requirement. You cannot, if a patient is surprised, it means you haven't gone through that informed consent process carefully enough. The patient should not be surprised at any stage. And again, you don't go through that informed consent process just at the beginning. If you've obtained informed consent and you're proceeding to treat the body part, you will then say, I am now going to lift the draping on your left leg and provide treatment there. I'm now going to cover up your left leg. I'm now going to raise the draping on your right leg and provide treatment there. So you can see you're keeping the patient updated, whether it's the positioning, the draping, the touching. You want to ensure that they're okay with this. Are you okay if I disrobe now and massage your buttocks? You advised me at the outset, but are you okay? That's putting the interest of the patient at the forefront. If you're always making sure that they're okay, because remember, the law says a patient can withdraw their consent at any point in time. You're making sure the patient's okay, you're making sure the patient's comfortable, and in doing so, you are demonstrating your professionalism. You're demonstrating that you're putting the interest of the patient at the forefront.
And also having that open dialogue, right? And having that open communication, allowing for the patient to be able to ask questions, if they're uncomfortable, to be able to express that to you, and for you to act accordingly, depending on what your patient is telling you, right? So listening, having a good listening ear, and making sure that you're really aware of your own surroundings and who is in front of you and why that's important.
I agree. And I know I kind of skipped over in the last slide, but one of the recommendations the college provides is, when you are, whether it's sensitive body parts or maybe any body part, if the patient would feel more comfortable with a third person present, of course, that should never be an issue, right? If it's going to make the patient feel better and the patient has consented to this. So when you talked earlier about, privacy, if the patient has requested that person to be present, then you clearly don't need to worry. The person is there to make the patient feel better. You don't need to be worried about treating a patient in the presence of a third party, because the patient has asked for it. So again, if you're always guided by what is in the best interest of the patient, you will maintain adherence to the standard.
Okay, so just to review with the next slide, providing patients with secure and private place to undress, using draping techniques during assessment and treatment, and having a third person whom the patient trusts for support.
Exactly. So if you're going through these steps, obviously, as we talked about, a lot of your patients will be disrobed. You want to provide them with a safe, comfortable place to do so. There used to be cases that I would view where a practitioner would simply turn their back and have the patient disrobe while they were still in the room. That would be a complete breach of boundaries. That would not make the patient feel comfortable.
Right.
The member might say this is the most efficient way to do it, but that's not in the best interest of the patient. Draping. On the issue of draping can obviously have huge consequences on the stress level and comfort of the patient. So having that discussion in advance and throughout is going to make the patient feel more comfortable. And as we said, sometimes depending on the gender or culture or age of the patient, reaching out and asking in advance, would you feel more comfortable if your mother or your father or a third person was present? Not waiting for the patient to have to ask. Remember this. Back to that vulnerability. Patients are going to be embarrassed to ask certain things. So you want to provide a platform. You want to provide a space where patients can avail themselves or say yes and say thank you for making this experience all the less stressful.
So we have to talk about record keeping again with the next slide. Why is it important to keep the patient's written consent for contact with sensitive areas on file? And what other measures can our members take?
Sure. So I'll start by saying, and this will not be a surprise to members, that informed consent must be documented. So any form of treatment, there must be a notation, there must be whether it's a form that the patient signs after you have gone through the informed consent process, or you're going to note in the record what steps you took to obtain informed consent. That has to be in the chart. And the reason why that has to be there is it is evidence that you can rely on and the college can view that informed consent occurred, because we know that treatment in Ontario cannot occur unless you've obtained informed consent. But this college, in a way to reassure patients and to reassure members that they are in fact able to treat certain sensitive body parts without concern of breaching the boundary standard or without engaging in sexual abuse. What this college has done is it has said to its members, if you are recommending a course of treatment that involves touching of sensitive body parts, we know you already needed to obtain informed consent. That's given. But what you also need to do is ensure after you've obtained informed consent from the patient that they sign this special written consent on the issue of the treatment of the special body parts, sensitive body parts. And that is evidence for the patient that they consented, and it's evidence for you that they've consented. So if in the, let's say 6 months later, a patient says, the member treated my breast, I never consented to that, I didn't know what happened. What the college has done is said, members, if you've obtained this informed consent and you've had the patient sign this dedicated form on that topic, you're going to be able to remind the patient, actually, we had this discussion, here is your signature. In my chart, we've gone over what we discussed, and the patient might go, oh, okay, I forgot about that. Or you might be able to show to the college, look, we went through this. So you can see it's only evidence of signing a form does not magically make it informed consent. It is evidence that you went through the informed consent process and that the patient expressly agreed for you to touch sensitive body parts, because we know that the law states that certain sexual touching of certain body parts results in instantaneous revocation if it is proven that that occurred. So you can see that this is a step that the college provided to reassure patients and to reassure members that touching on sensitive body parts only occurs if the patient has signed that written consent form.
Great. I think that concludes this part of our presentation. I would like to sort of paraphrase a little bit and ask you situational questions,
Sure.
if you're okay with that.
Sure.
We've had a lot of questions come in with the college, and I just kind of picked a couple that were at the top of my mind, and
Sure.
I think a lot of people would find it interesting if I ask them. Some of them are personal, some of them are not, so
Okay.
I just want you to bear with me. So I have a friend who would like to try acupuncture. Can I provide them with a free treatment?
So whether a member charges or not, will sometimes, to be frank, sometimes that's not the concern of the college per se. The business practices, some business practices the college will be concerned about if it abuses patients, but whether you charge or not is usually not the issue with the college. But if you decide to treat, let's say, anyone and you don't charge them, you're still treating them. So you still need to go through all those steps of ensuring you've obtained informed consent. You're going to want to document all that informed consent. So you're going to have to create a chart. You're going to have to go through all those steps. You're going to make sure that you have all the necessary information from your friend, and we'll get back to that in a moment, before you provide any treatment. So you can see that even if you're saying, hey, it's a Saturday night, my friends come over, I'm just going to provide acupuncture, you're providing treatment. You're an acupuncturist. So you better ensure that you have met all the standards and the legal requirements that the college insists upon. So that's the first issue, free or not. Second issue you mentioned was your friend. So as we saw earlier, it is a standard of the profession to not treat people that you're in a close personal relationship with, because there is that blurring of the boundaries. So based on that scenario, my advice would be, if you engaged and tried acupuncture on your friend because she wanted to try it out, you would be breaching this boundary. It's this standard. So my advice would be, don't do it. Refer your friend to a great colleague that you know, and that way you are going to completely ensure compliance with this standard.
Perfect. And I think it's also important for our members to know what hat you're wearing at all times, right? Are you wearing the friend hat, or are you wearing the professional hat?
And does the patient know? Right?
Exactly.
The patient get confused. So that's not the best interest of the patient. So avoid that scenario altogether.
Great. So my next question is, my patient would like to give me a small gift for the holidays. Am I able to accept it?
So my advice would be, again, we've talked about the cultural issues. In a perfect world, you would be very gracious and say, this is so kind of you. I can't accept this, but I can maybe give it to my staff, or I might be able to donate this. Thank you so much. And I'm hopefully you're not thinking I'm rude. I'm not allowed to accept gifts. So I'd say that would be, a great sort of way to deal with the situation. We've talked about in certain cultures, you may be offending the patient if you don't accept it. So in that very, exception, you might accept it and explain, thank you, please, you don't need to do this again. In fact, I'm going to ask you not to do it again because I might get into trouble. And then you just note in the patient record what occurred and why that standard was arguably breached, but because of that rare situation. So the short answer is it's the best just to be very gracious, to thank the patient, to advise them that you can't do so, but they can either take it back or it will go to a great home. And that way you've informed them so that next year at the holiday, whatever holiday it is, there's no sense of awkwardness. And you're like, oh my goodness, I have to, how do I say it now when I accepted it last year? So same thing when we talked about any sort of professional boundary that the patient might be breaching, it's best just to be upfront, to be very thankful and gracious and professional, but deal with it at the outset.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's the little things that sort of add up to a bigger thing. So if we nip that in the bud right away, then we won't have to have this occur the next year, the year after, or any other occasion. So we live in a world of social media, Facebook, Instagram. Is it appropriate to accept a friend's request on social media?
So the lawyer in me would likely say no. That would be blurring boundary. We talked about the importance of being professional and personal. And this is really difficult in today's day and age, right? Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn has really made it somewhat ubiquitous. Everyone is sort of connected. So again, it might sometimes depend. So if a patient reaches out and asks to be connected on LinkedIn, my advice would still be no. But if that did occur, you would want to ensure that every posting that you made was incredibly professional on LinkedIn, that you didn't want to kind of come across as jokey, where the patient would be witnessing to that. So you can see the safest approach to ensure full compliance would simply not to accept those those invitations. Sometimes you can just kind of ignore them, but the best approach would be to not accept it, because it has the potential of blurring the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know of a lot of practitioners who have a professional page as well as a personal page. So with Instagram or with
Great
Facebook,
idea.
just have a professional page, only accept requests on your professional page and not your private.
That's a great idea. That's a fantastic idea.
Because there's also information that, you know, like a lot of people like to put out as far as seasonal eating, tips with acupuncture, staying warm, like all of these things with seasonal balancing. So you want the information to get out there, but you want to keep it as professional. And black and white as possible. So
that's a
is
great compromise.
page.
I like that. I like that.
A patient asked me out on a date during a recent treatment session. What should I do?
Yeah. And this will, I've talked about how, you know, nothing should be awkward because you're going to be professional. I completely concede that this would be a little uncomfortable, right? So the short answer is you have to say no. If you say yes, you're engaging in sexual abuse. Even if you say, I will stop being your practitioner today, I'll remind your members that the law in Ontario is that even if your patient asked you out for a date on May 1st and you ceased treatment on April 30th, the day before, that person remains a patient for a full year. So for sexual abuse provisions. So you can see why it is absolutely not negotiable that you date any current or former patients for at least a year, and in certain situations it may never be appropriate to date a patient. So if you are asked out on a date, you know, the safest approach, and it'll depend on how you're, you know, if someone's just saying, hey, can we go out for coffee? It might be completely appropriate to explain, sorry, I can't do that. Thank you, I can't do that because I need to maintain professional boundaries. Are you okay if I still remain as your practitioner or not? That might be an appropriate discussion to have on a coffee request. But if it's a full let's go on a date, let's take you out for dinner, I'm really attracted by you, that's done. You can no longer treat the, that is not the best interest of the patient.
And also there's a power dynamic, right?
Exactly.
Like sometimes when somebody is coming in for a pain and you're the only one that could help them, and they feel totally grateful, but they're not in the most stable state at the moment because they feel so much gratitude, they might mistaken that for other feelings, right? Yes. So I think that's a very, very important topic to touch upon.
I agree.
Sometimes patients ask me about my personal life. What do I need to consider before I start talking about my personal life?
There we go. And this will happen. And this will happen because your patients are going to like you. Your patients are going to be interested in you. Some of your patients might be coming to see you quite a bit and might see pictures on the wall or might hear chatter in the waiting room and want to follow up. And not to be nosy, but just to demonstrate that they care. So this will happen. And so the best thing to do is again, be gracious, be polite, but you want to ensure at no point do you disclose information that causes the boundaries to blur. So, you know, wouldn't be appropriate. It would be totally fine if someone says, oh, I see there's a photo there of your daughter. Where does she go to school? And you don't have to say, oh, I can't talk about my daughter. I don't have a daughter. No, yes, I have a daughter. Thank you. She goes to school in the city. Oh, well, where? Oh, it's, you know, it's probably not appropriate for us to talk about this right now. Let's get back to your treatment. So you can see, you can be very gracious. You don't have to be rude and abrupt, but you have to reassert those boundaries. You have to
Right.
always ensure that you're always communicating to the patient. I'm here as your practitioner. You're here as the patient, and let's keep those roles clean.
And always try to segue your conversation back to the reason why the patient is there.
Exactly.
Right? They're the most
Exactly.
important thing, and
Mhm.
you're there to facilitate a controlled act, and you're there for them, not the other way around.
Perfect.
What are specific boundary considerations with respect to telepractice, including the use of text messaging?
So let me break my advice into two. One, whether it's telepractice or in-person practice, all the standards really will apply. So whether you're doing telepractice, you still need to be professional. You still need to be, you might be not being able to physically touch, but your comments, your demeanor, your state of dress, you wouldn't want to show up and, stand up and not be wearing pants, for example. We've heard of horror stories. Professional, 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 okay? So the standards will apply whether it's telepractice or not. On the issue of text messaging, I have seen a lot of professionals get into trouble with text messaging. And the reason, I think, is that it is so familiar. It is so easy. It's through your phone. You use the use of emojis, the use of quick, acronyms. It instantaneously makes things less professional. It makes things a little more comfortable. Friends text message. So I have seen a lot of health professionals get into a lot of trouble with text messaging. Ideally, I would say that any messaging occur through, if it's email or in person, that is usually the best, because it injects some formality, but also remember, any communication you have with your patient forms part of the patient record. You're not going to be having discussions with a patient that shouldn't belong in the patient record, because if you're having discussions with your patient that aren't related to treatment, ding, 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 you're into the personal situation. You've breached the boundary. So
Right.
on text messaging, when I'm reassured by certain health professionals that it was all professional, I will say, so where is this in the chart? And you can see their face drop. So, well, I didn't include it in the chart. So you can see the risks, you can see the concerns where text messaging comes into play. And again, some members might say, I have a professional phone, it's not my personal phone, but some members are using their own personal phone to do text messaging. No patient should have your personal phone number. There's a reason why the college does not place that information on the public register. Again, boundaries. So my advice would be, do not communicate with your patients through text messaging. I can see your office, your clinic may be sending reminders through that's a great service, but that's not you engaging in discussions with the patient.
Right. A lot of the time with my patient care, we don't really discuss anything via text message or email, just because it is that private matter. But a lot of the time they'll say, I'm running 5 minutes late. Or if we don't pick up the phone, they'll text and say, I need to cancel my appointment due to XYZ. I find those types of texts are appropriate, but I think anything outside that you do need to record in your chart for record keeping purposes, that is a black and white line that just actually needs to be drawn down the middle.
Agreed. And never use emojis. Please never use emojis. You're very loaded.
Very loaded, yes. So that concludes the questions that I prepared for us. I'm not sure if there's any questions that came up in our chat box, but I'll hand it off to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much. And we actually do have a question that relates to something that Rebecca just addressed a little bit earlier. And the question is, how can I politely not tell a patient whether I have children?
So you can do just that. If a patient asks you, do you have children? And there are obviously no clues one way or the other, it is completely appropriate to say, oh, thank you for the request, but I'm not comfortable in disclosing that information. back to that honesty. Just to be the end of the day, if you default to patient interest and simply being polite and accurate, you are not going to get into trouble. The college isn't expecting, when we say public, always putting the interest of the patient first. That doesn't mean being able to answer or give in to every wish that every patient may have. No, no, no. We're talking about professional interests. So if a patient asks you about personal matters, that's of no relevance to their treatment. So you would be, simply because they may want to know, doesn't mean you have to tell them. So it would be completely appropriate to say, oh, you know, thanks for asking. Let's focus on your care. Let's focus on you right now. That's totally appropriate. You know, I would say if you responded by saying, how dare you ask me, and screaming at them, not so good, not demonstrating professionalism. So you can see not only what you say, but how you say it will be very important and will indicate how professional you're being. But at no point in time are you obligated or required to disclose any personal information. And as we talked about, you really shouldn't be disclosing personal information.
And there's ways to say it. I mean, you can be professional and kind at the same time. You can politely decline to answer, or like Rebecca said, just move the conversation back to the patient, because that information is not going to help them with the current situation that they're in.
Great, thank you. We do have another question here, and the question is regarding sensitive area consent. Do we need to get consent every treatment, or is getting it for the treatment plan enough?
So, Amy, you can jump in if I'm incorrect, but what I believe this council, that they determined that if a treatment plan is proposed and is agreed to by the patient, the written consent only needs to be signed on the first appointment. Now, remember, if that treatment plan changes at all, you're going to have to start at square one again and go through that process and get the signature again. I'd also recommend that even though you only need to get the written signature at the outset of the treatment plan, at every treatment session, you're going to want to revisit and ensure that they still consent. So no, you don't have to have them sign another form, but putting the interest of the patient at the forefront. At every treatment, at every appointment, you're going to go through any symptoms, any side effects, how you feeling. Are you still okay if we proceed with that treatment plan that you agreed to 3 weeks ago? So you can see right there, you've reaffirmed the consent. You don't need to get it re-signed again because the treatment plan hasn't changed, but you're going back to the patient, making sure that they're okay in proceeding. Amy, what do you think?
In my practice, I usually have the form that they sign for sensitive areas, as well as a consent form. But each time I do say, this is what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be draping you this way. This is what's going to be exposed. We'll be placing needles in this area. Are you okay with that? Do you have any questions? So it takes less than 10 seconds for anybody to say that. And I think it's important to stress that every single time, only because you don't know where the mindset is of the patient.
Good
Something
point.
could have happened at home. Something could have triggered on the way there, and they're no longer comfortable with the treatment. So it's important just to kind of feel out where they are that day. And it takes less than 5 seconds to ask those questions.
I don't see any. I think there's still maybe some questions coming in. Some of those questions we can probably provide some documents. For example, there's a question, is there a template document for sensitive area treatment?
Answer is yes. Yes, your college website has a wealth of resources. Before we took down the slide, the PowerPoint, you'll see a bunch of resources the college provides to you, whether it is the jurisprudence. Thank you. Look, magically things appear. So these are some of the standards that touch on some of the topics that we talked about, the standard for maintaining professional boundaries, the standard of preventing sexual abuse, the standard for consent. The college has also put together a record-keeping guideline to assist you members in how to comply with all these expectations. And of course, the professional misconduct regulation, which is not a long document, but this is a document passed by the legislature, which sets out what are some of the acts of professional misconduct for this college. So it's a really good idea to review that and remind yourself that if I engage in such conduct, it could be considered professional misconduct. So the college has these all available on their website. And Claudia, I believe you're completely correct. What this college has done in the past with other webinars, if when questions come in, they are collected, the college staff put together answers, and then they are posted and disseminated as sort of frequently asked questions to assist members in understanding how to comply with these expectations.
We do have another question. If a patient invites my family member on their ceremony, can my family maintain their own relationship with them?
So, great question. I hate to sound like the lawyer, but here I go. It'll depend, because my concern would be is if a family member, if a family member is very friendly with your patient, there is a risk, not always definite, but a risk that boundaries could be blurred. You know, the patient might know information, personal details about you that makes them feel a little more comfortable and maybe more comments. And you may feel a little more awkward to put up that hand and say, I'm sorry, no, I can't engage in that. So you can see the risks that can engage. You know, it may be proper or more prudent to refer that patient to another trusted colleague to avoid that risk altogether. Now, again, some facts might cause me to deviate or amend my advice, but as a lawyer, my role is really to identify and flag risks, and simply that scenario as presented does pose some risks, that the boundary of maintaining professional boundaries, that standard will be contravened. Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree, because maintaining that professional boundary is our number one point as far as being a professional member of this college. So, you know, I can give an example of, let's say my sister has a best friend who wants to come to try acupuncture, but then again, my sister's best friend would know all these things about me. I would not feel comfortable with treating this patient.
Thank you very much. With respect to some of the other questions that we had, some of them were directly already addressed as part of the question box. So any other questions that we have, we're going to definitely be addressing them as part of our frequently asked questions. As both Rebecca and Amy already mentioned, we also have those resources available as part of our webinar. And again, we have a significant resources available on our website to help you know, provide additional guidance and assistance to our members with respect to documentation pertaining to maintaining professional boundaries. At this time, I would really like to thank you, Rebecca and Amy, for really sharing your knowledge with the membership. Very much appreciated. For those members who arrived a bit late, as mentioned earlier, this webinar is definitely available to obtain professional development credit. And in addition, we will have the webinar posted online at a later date, including, as we mentioned before, frequently asked questions. Now, from one perspective, we will be sending a survey to all of our attendees. We do ask that you provide your feedback, because it really helps us, the college, to provide future educational seminars, webinars that are actually important to you, that are relevant to you. So we really want to hear from you. And again, any other questions that come up, please don't hesitate to email them to us. Otherwise, we can include them in the frequently asked questions. So we hope you enjoyed today's session. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend.